So I'm doing a series of videos on here called Story Time, and it's basically, different stories that I have to tell about going through shaken baby syndrome. And, my daughter suffered from shaken baby syndrome at 3 months old, and she survived, but with severe disabilities, and then she passed away. And this was about 3 years ago that she passed away. So throughout that time, we just have a lot of different stories to tell, lessons learned. And so I want to share those stories. Today I'm going to talk about step-parent adoption. So this has to do with her because it was her biological father, my now ex-husband, who was the one that was accused of shaking her. And so whenever all of that happened, he was not like immediately charged with, shaking her. We went through the court system, and basically they took custody from him and made it to where he could not see either of our children, because we had 2 children, the one that was shaken and then an older child. But he could not be alone with them, and it was under my discretion if he had visits with her. Basically, is how that happened with both children. And so because of that, they dropped criminal charges. So he had no criminal charges pressed against him, which means he still had rights to the children. And they would not take rights because they had no one to give rights to. Because at the time, I wasn't remarried yet. And so about 2 years after after my daughter was shaken and got a divorce and all these things, I got remarried. And so God, only God, opened up the door for a step-parent adoption. So I'm going to tell that story real quick. So for us, my ex-husband was still trying to be involved in our children's lives, which I felt was a lot to do with just spite. And there was not really any effort put into a relationship with the children, with especially my, older child, who at the time was 3 years old, I think. But there was no real effort into putting, time into a relationship or, trying to actually get to know her. It was just, he would say, "Can I see the kids on a certain day?" And I would agree or not be able to agree. And we would meet in a public area, and he would see the children. Well, there was no, trying to connect with her, trying to actually talk to her, anything like that. It was just basically standing there watching her play at a playground, without really trying to connect. So there was no effort, in my opinion, that he really wanted to be there. It was more of, he loathed me, he hated me, and he blamed me for a lot of things. And so, anyways, leading up to the step-parent adoption, well, if the biological father, who still technically had rights, was involved in the children's lives, then there was no way that their stepfather, which was my current husband, could adopt them. And which was fine. I was going to be okay with that, because for the way I saw it, they were still protected and safe, and they still had him as a father, even if he wasn't legally their father. So the opportunity came up whenever he kind of just disappeared for a little while. I don't know exactly what he was doing, but my ex-husband, he disappeared for a while. And because of that, or actually, I think I do know what happened. So up until a certain point, I didn't realize that there was places out there that initiated or that gave you a place to have visits like this when DCS is involved. So apparently there's places out there. This one was called the Helen Ross McNabb Center in Tennessee, East Tennessee. And they will give you a safe place to go, where it's like a neutral place where they take notes. They have someone there to do visits in situations like this. I wish I had known that from day one, but I didn't. So whenever I found out about that place, I said, okay, we're going to start having visits at this place where it's a neutral place. It's a safe place. There is no, butting heads about where to meet, when to meet, all those things. It was, it felt much safer to me because you have like a mediator type person who is in there taking notes about everything that happened during the visit. So if he were to act up, if he were to do anything inappropriate, it's going to be noted by a professional, in this professional setting. And so I thought, we should have been doing this a long time ago. And you have to pay for those visits, but if you had a certain income limit, you don't have to pay for them. So it wasn't like he couldn't afford to pay for it or to have it waived, like a waiver. So whenever I found out about this, I told him that we were going to start meeting there. Well, he's like, kind of blew up about it and then was like, okay, fine. So what happens is when you start to meet at a place like this, the person will call both parties and you have to fill out some paperwork on the days that you can meet, days you can't meet, things like that. And they kind of mediate that so that you don't even have to deal with it, which is a huge blessing. So they were contacting me, they were contacting him. I filled out the paperwork. They said they were waiting on his paperwork. And I thought, okay, well, we're going to do visits starting there now. So he never completed everything that they required of him. So all of a sudden visits just stopped. And, at that point I was remarried. And so the visits just stopped because he didn't ever follow through with the paperwork. So I kept getting a hold of them and saying, has he turned his paperwork in? And he hadn't turned it in. And so he kept trying to text me and harass me about meeting outside of that area. I'm like, no, we're meeting here. Just turn your paperwork in. So after about 4 months, you're able to take it to court to say this person has abandoned his children and deserves to have rights taken away and rights given to the person who is there every day, which was the stepfather. So I contacted an attorney, and that was a only God moment because I had no money to spend on this. Okay, so anyways, there was no extra money for this. And so I contacted an attorney, Miles Brinson, family attorney in Knoxville, Tennessee, who is amazing. And he's like, yeah, I can take your case, but I need the retainer fee, whatever, by Monday. Could you do that? And I'm like, sure. And it was Friday. And I was like, yeah, I have the money. I don't have it, but I know that God's going to provide it, So I did everything I could that entire weekend to raise that money to meet with him on Monday because I knew it was time sensitive. Because at any time, if my ex-husband was to just pop back in, then it would kind of discredit everything. So the fact that he had been absent for 4 months was what gave us grounds to even try this. So, I raised that money. God gave me that money is more like it, but I put in the effort. I took the prompting from God that he would provide, and he provided that miracle. He provided the money within 3 days, and it was like $4,000 or something. So anyways, met with him, paid him, and he's like, I believe that you have grounds for this, but there's no way to know for certain how this type of thing goes, but we're going to try. So it took, I think, over a year. And in that time, Krista passed away. And so, it was almost like, man, justice was not served soon enough because it didn't happen while she was alive. But anyways, throughout that time, there was so much prayer because so much was unknown. We had to go back and forth in the courtroom because he tried to fight it and he tried to get an attorney, and his attorney was a big jerk, and he kept asking 10 million trillion questions over and over that were completely irrelevant, and it was just dragging things out. So what's supposed to happen in one day took 4 different days in court. And if you know anything about the court system, it's very slow. So it ended up taking over a year for this. But throughout that time, I had a lot of inner turmoil of like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? These are my children. This is the most important, most valuable thing in my life. And it's just kind of up in the air of what's going to happen. And so, because it could have always backfired and something happened to where they're like, he deserves to have rights or custody, or, you know, anything could have happened. And they could have forced me to do more visits or something. So throughout that time, I had to really lean on God and say, God, I trust you. I trust you. So we learned from a book called The Circle Maker by Mark Batterson to pray circles around things. Literal circles is what we started doing. So every time we would have a court date, like the day before, we drove around that courthouse 7 times, just like it was the walls of Jericho. And we prayed around the courthouse for God's favor, for his blessing, for whatever his will was, for us to be able to accept his will if it wasn't what we wanted. And we just prayed for God's power and God to just show up for us, and for, you know, for whatever had to happen in that courtroom to provide us with protection and safety. And, you know, ultimately we wanted God, what God wanted. But we just prayed and prayed and prayed every time. And, you know, the results were that we did end up winning. And it felt like after 3 years of no justice being served at all in the courtroom, that justice had finally been served. He finally had his rights taken away to a child that he destroyed her life, and it ultimately killed her. And he lost. And so that entire time he had the feeling, because he had harassed me through text message saying, I won this, you know, I won, whatever that even meant. But he had finally been put in his place and rights taken away. He could no longer hurt our children. One had passed away at the time, but my older child, he could no longer hurt her. And she finally had the dad that she deserves, that every child deserves. Children do not deserve a dad who's coming in and out of their life all the time, who don't really care about them, who has abused their sibling to the point to where they died, and then still be forced to be around that person. That is crazy to me, that they will make a child do that. That my older child, if God didn't work this miracle in our life, my older daughter would have had to face this man who she understood eventually, as she's 8 years old now, understands things, would have had to face the man who killed her sister because the court didn't protect her. And so that blows my mind. But thank God, only God could have provided a miracle like that, because it looked for years like the court was going to do nothing. And thank God that he decided to, you know, to rebel against my idea of having meetings in this different scenario that he couldn't control, that he was going, you know, he found himself powerless in that situation. And so he decided, well, I'm not even going to do that. So anyways, that was our story about step-parent adoption. Thank God it went our way. I don't know what life would be like right now if it didn't go that way. What it would be like for my daughter, what mental struggles she would have. And so, you know, there are happy endings to some stories. You know, my daughter passed away because she was shaken. That's not a happy ending to story, other than the fact that she's fully healed and in heaven. But justice was eventually served in some way. And so you just have to trust that God knows best, that he's going to work things out, and just put the trust in him, even if it takes years. That was 3 years or 4 years, something like that, after she was shaken. And so by that time, I had thought nothing was going to happen here on earth, but God did provide. And so that's our story. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video.